Hello everyone, today we read and comment on the fourth chapter of the second book of von Clausewitz, Vom Kriege. The conception of law in relation to perception is not necessary for the conduct of war, because the complex phenomena of war are not so regular, and the regular are not so complex, that we should gain anything more by this conception than by the simple truth. And where a simple conception and language is sufficient, to resort to the complex becomes affected and pedantic. The conception of law in relation to action cannot be used in the theory of the conduct of war, because owing to the variableness and diversity of the phenomena, there is in it no determination of such a general nature as to deserve the name of law. But principles, rules, prescriptions, and methods are conceptions indispensable to a theory of the conduct of war, insofar as that theory leads to positive doctrines, because in doctrines the truth can only crystallize itself in such forms. As tactics is the branch of the conduct of war in which theory can attain the nearest to the positive doctrine, therefore these conceptions will appear in it most frequently. Not to use cavalry against unbroken infantry except in some case of special emergency, only to use firearms within effective range in the combat, to spare the forces as much as possible for the final struggle, these are the tactical principles. None of them can be applied absolutely in every case, but they must always be present to the mind of the chief, in order that the benefit of the truth contained in them may not be lost in cases where that truth can be of advantage. If from the unusual cooking by an enemy's camp his movement is inferred, if the intentional exposure of troops in a combat indicates a false attack, then this way of discerning the truth is called rule, because from a single visible circumstance that conclusion is drawn which corresponds with the same. If it is a rule to attack the enemy with renewed vigor as soon as he begins to limber up his artillery in combat, then on this particular fact depends of a course of action which is aimed at the general situation of the enemy, as inferred from the above fact, namely, that he is about to give up the fight, that he is commencing to draw off his troops, and is neither capable of making a serious stand while thus drawing off, nor of making his retreat gradually in good order. So this is the second part of the fourth chapter that we split into different videos for the sake of simplicity in the comment and critique. So in here, as you understand, von Clausewitz is praising the importance of having a theoretical building, right? Made up of all these knowledge, right? This different hierarchy of information that we get from the experience of warfare in different ways, right? But it's just what we know about war. And he makes some examples on what we're talking about in the first place when we observe things like law, principles, rules, prescriptions, and methods. So that he actually expresses, especially in tactics, right, where the validity of these ideas is more evident, right, because the system is simpler and therefore is somewhat more intelligible, right, but never quite at the point of having an actual understanding of whatever is going on in its entirety, sometimes not even by a small margin. And yeah, he says this the conception of he starts from law, right, that we have seen in a previous video to be the kind of the most obvious and self-evident dynamic of war, right, that we occupy to describe through a law, let's say better, and that however is so self-evident and obvious and permanent that at one point, as he writes here, becomes almost impractical, because basically it is so theoretical that it matches with the truth, but it doesn't show you how to deal effectively with something more complex by method, by prescription. So he writes, the conception of law in relation to perception is not necessary for the conduct of war, because the complex phenomena of war are not so regular and the regular are not so complex that we should gain anything more by this conception than by the simple truth. As when I offend you, I cause you damage, right? And I also consume resources from my energies from my own side. So the question is, yeah, this is a general law, but how much does it help effectively while I am out there and I'm commanding an army or in fighting in general at every level of the contingent to know what I have to do, right? That's evident, self-evident. It's physics, right? It's literally a law at that point, and it's important to tie this to the scientific roots of reality. But at the same time, how this can be helpful, von Clausewitz in here goes as far as saying basically it's useless, right? It's not that it has no importance in the theory of the conduct of war and the art of war properly meant, but it's something that you understand as, as it happens, and also progressively, and it doesn't make much of a difference after all, right? It's simple logic in some ways. So how can it help? It really doesn't, right? Because the complex phenomena of war are not so regular like the ones described by law, and the regular are not so complex, right? So there is this incompatibility, right, between the actual gain that you need to, in terms of knowledge of what your action should be based, and what you can observe from this simple truth, right? It's as if truth here was so, in front of our eyes that we don't feel the need even to investigate it further. And this doesn't mean, however, that simple things that happen are basically intelligible in all their aspects, right? But sometimes they are so abstract that they don't feed basically anything useful for what concerns here the construction of a theory of the art of war. Remember that here we're still talking fundamentally and especially now in this chapter, what the theory of the art of war is made of, right? Its own bricks. So the law in this regard is something that even abstracts the military, the theory of the art of war properly meant. It's something that belongs to reality, to the physical world, but at the same time it doesn't quite help, right? We can already spot it, we already know what it is, and it doesn't help to prescribe us something further, right? And or to help us in more than the immediacy of our behavior is able to do. And here von Clausewitz writes, and where a simple conception and language is sufficient, to resort to the complex becomes affected and pedantic. This is also very important, right? There are certain simple things. This is valid a bit for all the theory of the art of war. The idea that you can and you should naturally study every single military aspect to really understand it better, right? But to the sake of theory, like you can't do that, for example, when you're studying a campaign or battle, right? In that point, you take basically everything, all the evidence you have, in order to reconstruct what happened. So at that point, it's fine to explore every single combination that can come out from this reconstruction and check if it holds, if it's likely, etc. It's a complicated thing. It's not that simple. Not just because of the most obvious shortage of evidence that we regularly have, but also because effectively even a very few data can be combined in very different ways. But it's limited exactly because of all of these interactions. But this, however, still doesn't mean that behind that law, right, or around that law, reality declinates actually in a simple way. And that's the point why you need to descend from law to other things, principles, rules, etc. Because even what seems actually von Clausewitz stated it in the past, that everything that revolves the conduct of war in practice is actually very simple. Even if you look at the organization of an army, at the end of the day, it's fairly simple, right? It's meant to be simple and simplified, and it always tends towards simplification to essentially counter the effects of the attrition, right, of friction, however you want to call it. But at the same time, what the way this instrument intervenes in reality and how it interacts with it is very, very difficult. So even behind a very complex notion like, in fact, as we were saying before, an attack, right? An attack to offend, to cause damage to the adversary, but at the same time losing resources yourself. Well, as a statement itself, it doesn't tell you basically anything on how reality is gonna be declined at that point, and all the things that you can, think associated to an attack that is it's simple as that conceptually, but it still can go in most different ways that you're not able to foresee most of the times, and a large part at least. Yet, von Clausewitz says, for the sake of the theory of the art of war, you shouldn't overcomplicate the theory in itself. Like, you shouldn't make this becoming hypertrophic at the point it becomes too heavy. It becomes more a burden than an actual help, right? Remember always that as von Clausewitz conceives the theory of the art of war, like a book you have to keep next to you while you're commanding, right? And you're dealing directly with a lot of stuff that is happening. You have to react immediately with. You don't even have the time to check the book. The book, even if you checked it, it wouldn't tell you what to do, but it would still provide you with some valuable information. It can be valid in general, right? And that maybe it's not valid at that given point, but still can give you some coordinate of at least what you should take into consideration. Always given that you are the one at the end of the day who is to assess what the hell is going on, so that the manual cannot do it for you. So this manual has to be simple, it has to be effective in that regard. It doesn't have to create an overcomplication of things, of settling. Now, naturally, this can, is an abstract, or if you want, rather theoretical ideal, in the sense that it's obvious that the theory of the art of war is built through an enormous amount of notions, right? And it depends on how much you want to approximate them. Just ask a person that studies military history for all his or her life, and you'll see that, they will tell you, well, we haven't studied even a small part of what we should know in the first place to conceive this reality of ours from the military point of view, right? So it always goes by approximation. We've seen it previously, right? So much that von Clausewitz here says that a doctrine can have a positive function, right? Always given that it's not necessarily, it's not going to solve the problem for you in the first place, right? It can help you, can be beneficial, but still it will not solve the thing. But it's better than nothing, right? And this is what the whole theory here is based on. And so don't be panicked. Even when this happens very often, when there are people who, study battles for the first time, and they look at it and they start speculating too much, right? The good military historian is the person who looks at the data and say, okay, we have to. Von Clausewitz actually puts it in a very cold way that freezes you, but at the same time makes you understand how serious the matter is, given the responsibility that employment of the military instrument entails. That is, basically, a good historian should never state anything that is 100% sure about, basically, or fairly sure, right, about the connection of cause-effect, right, relation cause-effect, right, of every single, why did this happen? Okay, we know it was this. And naturally, von Clausewitz here is very rigid because he is making us understand Not that we shouldn't basically then say anything about anything in the first place, because nobody is sure 100% about things that happen by any standard. Not even scientific language works like that. But he's simply telling us that we should be reasonable in our judgment, so that even if there are lots of options of things that can't happen, and therefore it's fine to be skeptical and to dismiss. Not definitively, but at least with a good, healthy benefit of the doubt, the most improbable aspect. That is rather focusing here on the positive part of the story. It is that being skeptical helps us to focus on the probability of what something can happen. In other words, the theory of the art of war is based on that probability. How likely is something to happen? And there are these absolute laws that are self-evident, and the more you descend in here, you get paradoxically something that is tricky, because ideas like principles, rules, prescriptions, methods, etc. are based on actual military historical evidence, right? And they do follow certain pattern that if you confrontate them, for example, the warfare of a given area in time in history, right? There are similarities, right? You look at 18th century warfare in Western Europe. Let's put it in this way. It's basically that. There were differences between the various military systems, but they're approximately, meaningless by certain standards. For example, the same armies that fought in the rest of the world, in the colonies, had substantial differences in there. They can spot, even though they were the same polity. But just to make an example in that regard, it's not that you can't be skeptical in this regard and say, okay, well, but there were so many differences, we can't generalize. Yes, but this obsession to avoid generalizations is also in part driving away from concreteness, right? This is a problem we have in heuristic approaches in academy. I think once today that we have discovered all of a sudden that categories most of the times do not work. Well, what a surprise, right? That's why categories were created, at least in the first place, right? You can't try to approximate something, and we know, it can't be perfect. We don't have to be sclerotic about it, but they still maybe function. And instead we have this disruptive and negative approach for which now we have to demolish everything, right? Not much because it seems to be wrong, right? This happens all the time with historiographical interpretations. There are certain assumptions that were written by historians, a few hundred years ago, and you, in the 19th century, go study them back, you understand they're old, they're somewhat outdated, but then you can see that in them there is still something valuable that effectively is also what, eventual and more updated historiographical theses were formulated on. So the idea here is to remain balanced more than else, but also to appreciate the general positive intent that the theory of the art of war has per se, right? That is not, it's a double-edged sword, I give you that, but in some ways, I think for human mind, it's way better to stick to the not necessarily optimistic side, because von Clausewitz demolishes that, right? More than the pessimistic one in some way. He's balanced, but he naturally pushes chiefly for destroying the optimism of a positivistic approach, but not the positivity, that such theory can have. And believe me, this is something that if you study history every day from sources, right, to try to effectively make an analysis, collecting all this data, and then trying to make a critical synthesis, you experience quite strongly. You feel this moment at the end in which you have to express fundamentally a judgment about what you have collected. What's the evidence? How much can we trust what we have collected What's the ultimate reasonable level of doubt about this that we can conceive, because we have to live of something, and it seems that after all, science and all our achievements as a civilization have been built on this. Okay, we know we may be wrong on some things, but there is still something that works here, right? This is the same thing from Clausewitz is saying. So it's actually a very subtle and sophisticated way of looking at the construction of the theory, but it's exactly the scientific model, and it does work, because science is not based on a dogma, on a doctrine that enforces you one reality that you can't check, right? Science is built in a very fragile way, if you want, but on evidence that you can put together that can crumble once again, but at least for, when you confrontate it with reality and you see you can apply that, well, in order to describe certain phenomena, does work. And even if this was actually the method, right, it seems that it did work, that through science we did improve sensibly our knowledge, our understanding, and we did made a positive, concrete, quantifiable change at our benefit, I think. So, and I believe in this. Like, I don't believe that there has been a moment in which we were basically better than we are now. And you can discuss on what this means philosophically in the first place, but I don't. I believe that taking certain standards, there's never been a better moment than today as general character of our civilization, and how can you deny it after all? Okay, let's not digress too much, because that can be criticized as well, but at the same time there is the realization that the reality we live is maybe even an illusion, an hologram, but we still live in it, and we know how to make it work from our perspective, and that is important. And then if we don't believe even in our perspective, what are we here for? So that's what Vom Clausewitz is showing you, actually a positive intent. And he reinforces the the doubtful character of the doubtful usefulness of the most absolute abstraction, right? It says the conception of law in relation to action cannot be used in the theory of the conduct of war, because owing to the variableness and diversity of the phenomena, there is in it no determination of such general nature as to deserve the name of law. Right? So this is very interesting, because it means that basically there is no law in the first place in the theory of the art of war. And we have seen it in the previous chapter. How this happened, how historically speaking the starting point was given this kind of fixed notions, these laws, these principles that were methodologically wrong in the first place, and they weren't even laws actually to start with. So, but anyway, then Von Clausewitz descends into these other elements of the theory, because he writes, but principles, rules, prescriptions, and methods are conceptions indispensable to a theory of the conduct of war, insofar as that theory leads to positive doctrines, because in doctrines the truth can only crystallize itself in such forms. Here the translation is not actually very accurate, because it talks about crystallization, and yeah, here what he really means is that there are certain forms that, the positive pattern of these either principles or rules, etc., must overlap, right? And this is also impossible, right? But it still attains a certain degree of positivity that helps, right? This is very, very important. In fact, he goes on saying, as tactics is the branch of the conduct of war in which theory can attain the nearest positive doctrine, therefore these conceptions will appear in it most frequently. So, as you read here in his language, he always talks about frequency, about this never absolute form of the theory of real truth of the theory of the art of war, right? The the idea is we can tend towards it, like as an asymptote in a function, but you never can make this thing overlap. Yet, by approximation, certain things can work, right? And now, in fact, von Clausewitz makes some examples that are very useful to understand what we're talking about in approximate terms. Because he writes, not to use cavalry against unbroken infantry except in some cases of special emergency, only to use firearms within effective range in the combat, to spare the forces as much as possible for the final struggle. These are tactical principles. So he starts from his principles and he says, for example, not to use cavalry against unbroken infantry. Now, this is a very good example because this is generally valid, right? It's a concept that even in the age of maximum development of heavy cavalry shock tactics was true, right? There is not a frontal impact against infantry just to throw it against it without having softened it up after before having spotted the weaker spots, in fact, in the line, etc. So is this valid? Well, generally yes, right? But it can also depend, how much cavalry you are talking really about, how much infantry, right? So you see here that we can easily put in relative terms this thing that is not absolute, right? What does it mean, an unbroken infantry, without even knowing where this infantry stands, how many numbers are? So what do we deduce from this? That this is the generalization that is worthless? Well, actually no, because we know that in general, on average, this thing is true. Then we have to take into consideration other factors that are there, and generally speaking, orientate ourselves in this regard, right? And it's interesting, it says, except in some case of special emergency, right? So he introduces already a kind of clause by saying, it depends, because if you're pushed by whichever reason, or there is a specific, in fact, tactical contingency, right? You have to try that. Let's assume, I don't know, something banal. That's you must attain an objective, must secure a position. There is just infantry between you and that objective to be reached, and you have the numbers to smash that infantry. You charge in it, right, with cavalry. Even if you don't manage to soften it up before, you may win, depending on also other factors. So you see how we can trace here a line, a tendency, but it's suspended into nothingness, but it still works. I mean, it's still very useful, right? And it's important because, if you take the Napoleonic Wars where von Clausewitz participated, there were such mistakes like throwing cavalry frontally against infantry without having it adequately weakened it preventively, and resulting into a disaster, right? So it's important for whoever wants to command to know this, and it's, this is a kind of an obvious information, but you should be aware that it's there in the first place. Then other principle, only to use firearms within effective range in the combat. Yes, I mean, well, you should if you know that quite likely you're not going to make damage on the enemy, right? And for Clausewitz was even living at a time in which as you know, musketry fire was quite reduced, and so even a few hundred meters could literally made the bullets bouncing on your skin when it hit you. So that's important, but obviously it has wider implications in here. What does it actually mean, right? It can even be related on the amount of ammo that you have at your disposal. It depends also on how effective this range is going to be on the target. Maybe it's not here what von Clausewitz is talking about, because that's yet conceptually another thing. But I mean,
there is an effect, that even a friction that happens within your ranks when you enact certain, you run out of ammo, you can be more figure. First of all, here all the air was filled with smoke, so you have an advantage of visibility at the first shot that you don't have to wait. So there are lots of factors that intervene here that, generally speaking, show us that this principle is true. Other principle that is very interesting: to spare the forces as much as possible for the final struggle. Right, and von Clausewitz will actually expand this in the work quite intensely. But it's the idea you need reserves normally, right? That the decisive moment is the last one. Right, the decisive move is the one that puts an end to the struggle. So it's very important in here to determine, and that's where it gets relative, is what is final, right? Because you are implicitly deciding at one point whether an attack is going to be final or not, right? It depends on how you use your reserves. If you send them gradually, one by one, with this gradual effort, or are you throwing your committing your whole army? And where at that point, what is final in time and energies is going to be determined by your choice. But the idea still remains generally that for that decisive action, you should spare forces as much as possible, because that's the most important moment, right? Because it's final. Here it's literally also a linguistical matter of logic, actually, purely of logic, telling the truth, because we also have to understand what the terms are, what final means. But it's still a validly acceptable principle, and it's actually useful. Then von Clausewitz writes, none of them can be applied, none of these principles can be applied absolutely in every case, but they must always be present to the mind of the chief in order that the benefit of the truth contained in them may not be lost in cases where that truth can be of advantage. So this is very, very important, because it puts into relation these principles with the truth, and what you realize in here is that there is always a share of truth in those principles, right? That never, like, it's not that truth is completely outside of those principles. It can, however, simply happen that there are other principles that are conflicting with, not among the inner logic of themselves, but they are interfering with the action in general, and that therefore you can't applicate that principle successfully in all times, because it's still true, but the amount of effect is going to make in every specific moment is going to be determined contingentally, right? And so it's important, because von Clausewitz says not that these principles are not true, but it says that they cannot be applied absolutely in every case. So it's two different things, and this is very fascinating, I would say, from a methodological and theoretical point of view, because it makes you understand that there is not a distrust in the principle in itself, but just the realization that this principle must be applicated into a reality. And it's paradoxically the same reality that has built the principle, that had rendered it valid, because we have accepted it to be on the basis of reason, right? And of an approximate judgment in this regard. But we live with it, we accept it, and we don't find anything strange in it, even if we perfectly know that we can't always use it, right? So this is very, very, very important, in my opinion, because it really makes you understand where your trust should be placed when you're looking at the theory of the art of war. That is fundamentally in yourself, right? It's in human understanding, and not in an absolute prescription that you must just follow blindly. It's always based on your discretion, not just in the way you applicate these principles, but also in the process in which these are formulated. that is through the analysis of military events. Alright, and this is fascinating because it's really the case. Like, one of the things that I think von Clausewitz is most attractive for in his theory is that when you study military affairs, you realize that these patterns do exist, like that you can interpret military dynamics through these general principles, even if they don't match at all times. And there are battles, especially that's why the art of war, right? Not just simply military history, but the history of the art of war, is fundamentally a diachronic and comparative study. And must be so, because otherwise it's not really. You can't pretend to study battle once and pretending that now I know what military history is about. No. You don't study many of them and you compare them, and you don't actually make this effort to try to understand every single element, right, on the evidence that we have in order to make valid assessments. You can't easily actually not understand much, right? There are people who read about this stuff for years, but they don't get it, right? And there is really an obstacle, right? If you don't surpass it, you remain under, and you remain there, right? There is a qualitative step you must take in this process. So, and what von Clausewitz is saying here is also that the commander should always be aware of these principles, right? And that's what a military education is really about. He can gain these from evidence, right? From his own direct experience, from the study of military history, but just he must know them, and therefore what he must treasure of them is the general truth contained in them. General meant as literally these principles contain it in the way they are formulated, but they're simply containers. They're not by themselves prescriptive truth that will make you solve everything, right? It's just a help, a secondary help, if you want. And the first one lays in your mind, in your perceptivity, in your coup d'œil, as von Clausewitz puts it. So, yes, and always this idea that just the commander should be aware of these principles, but still reverting to them when he needs. Not that he should be distracted by the construction of a theory that should get into, thoroughly more deeply into it at the minimal detail, right? That can be useful, but this is not what in action will make the difference. You will not even have the time to do that. So that's also why before von Clausewitz says that, you can't be so pedantic about every single thing and trying to, restart with this enumeration of all the various possibilities can happen, because these possibilities will present each time in a different way. So it's useless, right? It can be a good exercise at some point, and you can try to simulate reality, but that's our problem. We can't reproduce reality. So there is no better way than observing reality in order to get this things. This is the general concept. This is what von Clausewitz is really interesting about, in practicality. The abstractions are useless. For the actual application, they are useless. And after all, what do we build a theory of the art of war for if it's not applicable? This is really the core of Clausewitzian method. I know it's somewhat... it's actually very simple if you think about it. There is nothing extremely elaborated or complicated, or in fact, it's not pedantic. It's based on logic, on reason, and staying open to what happens. Because without that, you think that then you can sort out practically everything about the universe, and we can't. It's as if there was a tiny bit of truth in all of these principles. All you have to understand is how much this can be amplified through the contingential application, right? Is it fitting? If it's not, that's a problem. But in general, it is so. So that's where the help comes from. Then von Clausewitz goes on and says, if from the unusual cooking by an enemy's camp his movements is inferred, if the intentional exposure of troops in a combat indicates a false attack, then this way of discerning the truth is called rule, because from a single visible circumstance that conclusion is drawn which corresponds with the same, right? So this is another example. So you see, the rule is basically a notion that you associate to a specific behavior that you can deduce, from which you can deduce the intentions of the enemy in advance, right? It can be flawed, it can be a trick, right? A ruse can actually be formulated on these rules as well, right? And there is even in here frequency in which this rule is confirmed, right? But there are exceptions, like to every rule, so this is not always to be the case. At that point, you have to be good at understanding through experience, once again, what the hell maybe that can mean, right? And that's why also these rules are more easily realizable as potential ruses, potential tricks, right? It says, from the unusual cooking by an enemy's camp his movements is inferred, right? Now, that's not something you can really conceal, right? If you really have to put yourself once again on the march, you have to anticipate the moment soldiers are fed. Well, yeah, you have to pass through it. The soldiers have to eat at some point, but there can be other ways to conceal that. I mean, the troops may even not eat at one point. You could eat in a different moment or in a different way. We know the level of deprivation at which a troop can arrive in case of need, right? And that's where you should be concentrated on, right? Always remembering that for von Clausewitz, war is a clash between moral forces. So it's not that soldiers have literally to eat every single time at a given moment to make you certain that that is going to happen. But you may not eat for an entire day. That is going to have some consequences, but you should be able to figure out, hopefully, whether those consequences are fitting with the general, intention, in fact, that you can deduce from these rules, or if maybe there is something behind that you have not calculated in the system, right? And nobody can, there's no, the war is made of this. It's literally about trying to sort out a system that by default we don't understand for a 75%, von Clausewitz put it like this, and on which to concretize an action, right? So this is really not a speculation problem. It's literally the whole theory is aimed at make you acting upon it on the base of it, right? So this is terribly important because you may fall into an enemy's trap just for trusting that rule, right? Also, intentional exposure of troops in a combat indicates a false attack if these basically are not they're not well equipped with you realize that from the weakness of an attack in that regard. If it's maybe just to attract you into to keep you to trouble you, to destabilize the situation, to make you think that, to distract you, right, as well. So that is possible, and you can deduce that from a set of information that you usually can spot into the enemy if you can assess what its strength is. Like normally an attack is waged up in forces. So if it's a small thing, what can it be, right? Maybe it's an accidental a meeting of with a vanguard, but how can you know? You don't know what's happening from the other side. There are lots of hints, but all of these hints are possibly part of very different scenarios that you're not necessarily going to sort out. But generally speaking, we say that by rule, where if a false attack is usually a weak attack, then it's a single visible circumstance, the conclusion which is drawn to correspond with the same. Then that's what a rule looks like. Also, when Clausewitz goes on, it says, it is a rule to attack the enemy with renewed vigor as soon as he begins to limber up his artillery in the combat. Then, on this particular fact depends a course of action which is aimed at the general situation of the enemy as inferred from the above fact, namely that he is about to give up the fight, that he is commencing to draw off his troops, and is neither capable of making a serious stand while thus drawing off, nor of making his retreat gradually in good order. So this is also another rule, right? If the enemy is essential, so here imagine von Clausewitz times warfare, right? Artillery is important. You see the Napoleonic Wars, the use of artillery is much more concentrated in terms of and enhanced in terms of firepower. Has been in the last centuries of the last decades of the 18th century was all a work of standardization. If you think about the Über system, actually was adopted by Napoleon and etc. So the first thing that is taken away is artillery, because in part it's kind of the most difficult to transport. It's a very valuable asset. I mean, it has a very high specific weight, generally speaking, in what they would call like conventional warfare. It's another definition I don't like, but as we were saying before, there is a kind of a shared pattern at this time in at least European warfare. And at that point, the enemy lacks firepower because artillery is going away. So basically, the rest of the troop is there. The rest of the troop is more flexible, can in part even defend itself during the retreat. But at the same time, it lacks substantial support fire. So that's the moment in which, as a rule, you should attack the enemy with renewed vigor, even doubling it fundamentally. Why? Because at this point, the enemy is weaker, right? Is not necessarily capable of making a serious stand while thus drawing off. Nor even later he's going to make a good retreat in good order. And if you keep on pressing on him, well, you're going to make a lot of damage proportionally compared to what would happen if he still had to respond to you with artillery fire. So this is a general rule that, however, doesn't tell you anything about whether by itself alone, which are other conditions that can allow you to do that. Because let's assume that the enemy is retreating just because they have to move more quickly to support another, battlefield, and therefore they're not retreating because they're scared of you. Maybe you are, inferior number 1 to 10, right? At that point, can you attack a force that is 10 times larger? In certain situations, it can happen, right? But normally, you would think, especially, you have just infantry, you don't even have artillery yourself. It can happen. Would you be able to attack the enemy with renewed vigor? What for? To get slaughtered? So that depends, naturally, on these other factors. But generally speaking, we assume, and this is also very interesting, in my opinion, from a military historical point of view, because it shows you that also an engagement, we'll see this better, in other passages from Clausewitz. It's fundamentally rare to find two forces that, given the contingencies in which they are located, let's put it in this way, they're present, uh, do not, I mean, engagements do not happen between forces that are too different. And here by force we're not meaning numbers, not necessarily even quality. It depends, once again, but quite rarely in a battlefield, as in the international politics, two people would go will fight against each other if there is, a massive asymmetry that basically reduces the moral force that pushes at this point the inferior side to go on with that fight, right? Usually forces that fight each other are similar in strength. And this is important because there are certain narratives when you look at military history, people would like to pretend that at one point there is this rhetoric of the lost cause, right? There were certain powers that were doomed since the beginning of the war to lose, and these judgments are based just on relative elements, like, I don't know, this country had less industrial capabilities, or I don't know, there were many different, or they had simply less troops, or whatever thing, less resources, were poorer, whatever. That by itself doesn't actually mean much, and if you study military history, you will realize that normally all of these powers were fighting because they actually had a good plan in order to win the war. They had good chances to do it, right? And naturally this also varies wildly on the base of politics and society, so you can't really tell, once again, methodologically speaking, according to von Clausewitz, it's about the armed forces. The armed forces are subordinated to a political intention. It can vary for whichever reason. So you can't fix to a single variable whatever the point is, right? And that's very misleading to do so in any circumstance. And most of the times, and war is beautiful in this regard. I mean, war is beautiful. I mean, it's beautiful to study in this regard, because you see the enormous range of options and possibilities that exist at some point. We tend, for didactic purposes, always to simplify things, to say, oh no, the war was lost because, there were this bunch of factors, end of the story. And this is very unethical to do, for many reasons. First of all, because in fact, wars are political acts by definition. So if you deal, once again, with war as a football match, right, you can't really understand what that means in the first place. That's why there are so many people who are apologetic even towards, certain conflicts in general, because they see it just a match that has gone wrong. I mean, it will be better next time. They completely don't see what's the deal from an ethical point of view. There were people that were sent to die and to kill others, by the way, for political choices that must be understood. So now I don't want to digress too much, because we could talk how politics intervenes at all times in the military, on the military instrument at every single moment. So that makes you understand how you can't in fact isolate the military instrument of war from politics at any time. We've seen it. Von Clausewitz was quite clear in this. There's not a moment in which you simply tell the military to do something and then they're out there on their own. It never happens, not even for a single instant. By default. First of all, because the military itself are people who have their mind, who have their background, who have their beliefs, who have their realizations, their moral force, right? So once again, the Clausewitzian Trinity is there not to detach or to separate all of these of the three elements, but actually to blend them together at all times. So that's very, very important to understand. Believe me, I can't stress this enough. And it does start from things like building a theory of the art of war. Because here the whole work that you're realizing is conceptual. I mean, this book, this work is not, the Vom Kriege is not going to tell, it's not a history book. It's not looking at you and saying, look, I assumed all these things because of this specific event. Like, von Clausewitz uses, of course, the specific historical events to make you rather understand why, what he's talking about in practice. But it's not assuming it the other way around, right? He's starting from the concept, because the concept is what can really clarify, as a synthesis from all the military historical knowledge that we have, what this theory is going to be about. And this theory should be used well, right? It's a good political, it's a political achievement to employ your military in an effective way, right? That doesn't tell you anything about why you're doing that. So that's why many people actually go straight and completely misunderstand von Clausewitz, thinking that therefore he can back every single kind of politics. No, he's referring in the political employment, in the political action, to the employment of the military. Then he doesn't tell you, like, and that can be good or bad, right? There are certain, normally military disasters are principally political failures, right? Not the other way around. And that's also what, unfortunately, we don't understand as societies most of the times. We think that, once again, it's the fault of the football team that was playing at that point. No, it's not that fault. The fault is political, right? And war is exclusively political. There is nothing about war that is not political by definition, right? But this side of the story is constantly forgotten, misrepresented, uncomprehended. I don't know how to say that, but it all starts from this clear realization. Right, there could be an enormous social benefit from the clarification of these concepts if people just studied this work, because it really clarifies your mind, it really puts everything in the order it effectively has, right? Okay, we had already finished here. I don't know, I think we could go on here, telling the truth, with the... Okay, next time we'll see regulations and methods, right? So today we cut at the point of... But I think this was a fair length, otherwise the video would get too, dispersive in some way. But I hope you really get what the concept here is, right? Do not misunderstand this work. This work is not a positivistic take, a modernistic, a technologistic, a mechanicistic take on war. The problem is that we are so soaked into these approaches to war that we don't even realize we are in them. So we don't understand what this thing is, because it's something alien from us, because we are so used to reason as a culture in this, with those prejudices, that we don't see the perspective here from the outside. And therefore we look at von Clausewitz saying, but what the hell does it is? You can, I don't know if you, well, maybe some of you do, but if you ever read anything about the criticism of von Clausewitz, right, where it comes from, and on which basis, and on which lack of basis, I would rather say, and I would say either hurt, bothered feelings. I don't know what it's really the attitude there. I don't know where that comes from, right? But it's maybe it's maybe tied, and it's an hypothesis, to the fact that von Clausewitz is showing you a paradox that we're not willing to accept. That is, that we can get valuable information from the unknown, while what we're used to do now is that we pretend to know something, and in fact we get unvaluable information. That's our story at this point in a nutshell. Von Clausewitz does the exact opposite, and he's right, because what he says works in reality, and it's been written on the basis of observation of reality. That's a big difference. Instead, we are used now to to speculate theoretically first, and then in an abstract form, and then pretending that reality fits in it, and we cry because it doesn't work, right? And this is a serious problem. This is something I said even on other occasions, like that up to 100 years ago, only like a 10% of the population was required to have a theoretical thinking. Most people were fundamentally just practically oriented, right? They did lack what was, that fitted that reality, right? Because society kind of needed to work like that. Now it's the other way around. Like in less than 1 century, we have shifted. We have basically inverted this proportion so much that now we generally good job theoretically, but practically we suck, right? So it's basically the same problem before reversed. And this has to do with the general level of education of people on these matters, right? It can't be solved otherwise. But von Clausewitz was still coming from a world that, in this sense, was more deeply and practically oriented, I would say. So this, he spent, as I often say, this was a veteran of the Napoleonic Wars. Right, he rose through the ranks up to becoming a general. He fought in all these wars. All the various wars of a coalition, he saw it all for decades, right? So he had definitely practical vision of reality, and he had also a very good theoretical knowledge of the reality. So he mixes them both, and that's what we need. We can't build a world in which we're just theoretical and just practical, and the risk is that we're becoming just theoretical, right? I don't want to start to rant about technologistic prejudices, but it seems like now we're surrendering to the idea that technology will do our job, right? And it's not a matter like people like the Terminator, where the Skynet takes over and we're doomed because the machines take over. The problem is much worse, like that we are already dependent on something that it breaks down for every reason. We're done for because we don't know how to do anything, right? Hunter-gatherers, can't survive to a disaster like an asteroid hitting the Earth. They already did, by the way. We can't. And this is a problem because such things can happen. We think it's unlikely, right? It's just like the pandemics, right? It happened twice since the beginning of the millennium, but hey, who cares? Now it happens, it's big, and we realized nobody was prepared. So you see how risky it is to leave things to the realm of theory, through the realm of mere, abstraction, of distancing ourselves from reality. We are immersed in reality, and we can't detach ourselves from it. And it's a great problem, and we'll see it now what will happen, because this thing that is going on is really going to change a lot in our world, and hopefully that is a chance to be, from these generations to actually stress the importance of responsibility and of a theoretical and practical education together, right, all together. But anyway, this is another topic we don't. Next time we'll make other 2 videos, I think, about the 4th chapter. It's not very long, but I think it's more interesting to digest it a chunk at a time, because it's very, very good and important information. These are really key. Like, as far as we've read now, everything is crucial, right? So the Vom Kriege confirms itself to be a work that you can't read like just cherry picking what you want, browsing in the pages, right? You have to go step by step. Everything he says is solidly important, and you can't miss that, because otherwise you will misunderstand the whole thing. This is a theory, a complex system. You have to understand every single part of it if you want to get what it's talking about in the end, right? And how this can be useful. And so far, it has really crushed here every kind of possible criticism, really, that preemptively. But anyway, we will see it next time. Next time's better. For now, I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming contents. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.